Hello, peoples. So, the reason I want to talk to you all today is about Carmelo Anthony, a player who historically has been viewed as either an elite scorer, one of the best to ever do it in that sense, and by a whole other group of people, has been viewed as extremely overrated and not worthy of many of the accolades he has acclaimed throughout the years. I'm more in the first camp, and I wanted to talk a bit about why. So firstly, I want to talk about the concept of overrated and underrated. Now, a lot of people, in my opinion, have this rather mixed up because we talk so much about the same people being overrated and underrated that it's lost a lot of meaning. For example, Mike Conley, before becoming an all-star, was the textbook definition of, you go on Reddit, Twitter, YouTube, most underrated player. But my question is, if everyone finds someone underrated, then how can they be so? Similar with overrated. If we talk about Carmelo Anthony as overrated, we talk about even Kobe Bryant or LeBron as overrated, or Westbrook as overrated. If we say it so often, it loses all meaning. Now, why do I feel that Carmelo Anthony is underrated, aside from purely being called overrated a lot? The reason why is because a lot of the things he has been accused of or blamed for seem rather unfair, and I want to walk through all of that today. So starting with his Denver tenure, the first few years, there's really not too much to talk about. He loses against the Timberwolves in Kevin Garnett's best season with that team, where they made the Western Conference Finals. He loses to the Spurs on a few occasions. He loses to the Clippers, which you could argue he shouldn't have. However, this was the most successful year of the Clippers until the Lob City days. And then in 2009 with Chauncey Billups, he reaches the Western Conference Finals, where he loses to the eventual champions. Now, it's well documented that the Western playoff bracket in the 2000s has been brutal. And realistically, the Denver Nuggets didn't have much of a chance as a contender, except for potentially 2009. Now, think about it. Who have Melo's best teammates been in Denver? You got Marcus Camby, Andre Miller, J.R. Smith, Nene, Kenyon Martin for the first few years. Near the end as well for some of those players. Some great role players and some solid starters. And even some near all-star caliber players. For Kenyon Martin, before getting to Denver. Once he got to Denver, injuries kind of caught up to him. But that's neither here nor there. The two clear teammates he had to support him were Allen Iverson and Chauncey Billups. Now, Allen Iverson could still score the ball at an elite level with Denver, much to what I'd like to call it an NBA fan's lack of knowledge around. However, his skills overlapped with Melo. You have two players do pretty much the same thing. It's not a good fit. So, I want to talk a bit more about Chauncey Billups, one of the more underappreciated players in NBA history. Now, he was a lead playmaker, floor general, and overall extremely valuable point guard, who a lot of people argue is better than Melo. A few advanced stats such as win shares do have his impact as being greater. I personally don't agree with that concept, due to Melo being the clear focal point on offense, which a lot of people do underrate, as it's difficult to consistently score buckets every single night. Consistency being what separates a good player from a great one. And even a great one from an all-time great one in some cases. Now, with that, his Nuggets tenure was very take it or leave it for a lot of fans. Unless you're a Denver fan, in which case you're probably not a fan of him. Which, I'm not a Denver fan, so your decision. Now, moving to New York. This is when a lot of his criticism started. His first one being that he was egocentric. The second one being that he went to a worse team just because he wanted to be in the Mecca. And the third one being the Jeremy Lin thing. Now, I want to start with number 3, even though that's not how numbers really work. Because the Jeremy Lin situation is one of the most overblown that I've seen, in my opinion. Reason being, firstly, Jeremy Lin is a good starting / sixth man player in his prime. A great sixth man, a solid starter. He, on the other hand, was not a star level player. You can look at his 10 years outside of New York, with Houston, the Lakers, Charlotte, and the Nets as proof. On all of those teams except for Houston, they could have really used a star level player with scoring punch. because Charlotte had Kemba, but that was before his prime, and plus Kemba kind of had to do everything because he didn't have enough offensive help, and the Lakers was when Kobe Bryant was in his swan song years, and there's a lot of youth there, so it was a good opportunity for him to take the reins. However, he was unable to do so. The reason for that being, firstly, wasn't an elite shooter, wasn't even a good shooter. I'd have him as below average to average. His playmaking for a guard, rather shaky. He didn't make the best decisions, he could make the open pass, but didn't have the ability to make those more complex reads. His first step was brilliant, and his finishing was solid. I'd even say good. Now, that 2-week stretch was amazing. The game winner over the Lakers, beautiful. I was a fan of insanity as well. However, when he faced the Heat, Mario Chalmers of all players, not LeBron, not Dwayne Wade, not Shane Battier, but Mario Chalmers put the end to insanity, not Carmelo. Now, what Carmelo did is he commented on Jeremy Lin's contract, which I'm not a fan of. Don't count another man's bread, don't talk on the contract, personal stuff, he shouldn't have done that. However, with that contract, it was a poison pill contract, which is now actually being banned. You can't do this anymore to try and circumvent the cap. The Knicks had a lot of dead money, which I will get into as well. However, they didn't have as much money to play around with as other teams. So while they did state they were going to match any offer they got, they weren't expecting the Rockets to offer a 3-year contract worth $25 million, which ironically now sounds like nothing. However, it was front-loaded with 2 years of $5 million each, and then back-loaded with a $15 million year contract. So the design was from the Rockets to screw over the Knicks, who did not have cap space in that 3-year period, or had plans to try and use that cap space differently. So the Knicks did not match because of that reason. Nothing to do with Carmelo Anthony. Carmelo's contract conversation and his comments, unacceptable, but the situation was not due to him. Now, the other situation is about the Knicks' talent, which firstly is pretty straightforward in my opinion. Amari Stoudemire was a dark horse MVP candidate when they traded for Melo. Not saying he'd win it, he wouldn't, but he was up in those conversations. And then his knee conditions got to him. He was never the same player, he was constantly out, and he was a massive contract. So the Knicks couldn't really do much about it. And the third situation is, I guess, Melo's ego and wanting to go to a worse team, which, you know, pretty similar. Amari Stoudemire, he got to the playoffs, went out in the first round, he went to the second round once. His shooting percentages looked okay to bad depending on the year. However, again, those do require context. His most successful year in 2013, where he got an MVP vote, his shoulder had been torn by KG in a play you could call dirty, depending on, as I said, what team you're a fan of. Most people would say unintentional, some would say intentional. Now with that, his shooting percentages weren't great, but he didn't really have much of a choice of who to pass to. His second option was realistically J.R. Smith, who played like absolute garbage. At the same time, Jason Kidd, who was a floor general in that season, missed the last, I think, 12 or 20 shots of his career in a row before he retired. He was done offensively. Tyson Chandler, great defender. Offensively, besides putbacks and rim running, doesn't offer much. And when Jason Kidd's missing every shot, teams can sag on Tyson Chandler a lot easier. And the rest of the team was a, mixture of decent role players like Steve Novak, who could do one thing in an elite way, but players in the playoffs that usually get made a lot less effective. Similar to what happened to Joe Harris in this season. So that was a wash for his time. At the same time, New York did not surround him with much talent, starting players like Pablo Prigioni, giving players like Lance Thomas meaningful minutes, giving Joakim Noah massive contracts, trading for Andrea Bargnani. After the Amari Stoudemire situation, they really did have to use that cap space crucially, and every time they absolutely failed. And again, that doesn't have anything to do with Melo. There was a whole thing between Phil Jackson and Melo. However, I might talk about that at another stage. I might not. What I want to do now is move on to the OKC days. So, the infamous clip, AP, I don't want to be here. We've all heard it. We all know what it's about. What I want to talk about is the context. So his last season in New York, Melo was an all-star. Injury reserve, but an all-star nonetheless. He was moving to an OKC team, whose backup power forward is Jeremy Grant. Not the Jeremy Grant you know now, but Jeremy Grant just after the process days. Unproven, young, exciting, but very raw. Melo was then asked as a previous all-star if he'd take up new roles, including being on the bench. Now, we all talk about how we hate, PR responses and regular responses, and we want cool sound bites, and that's what Melo gave. He said what most people in that situation would, purely that he thought it was a joke. He could have handled it better, but it's been blown out of proportion considering. He started the season with OKC playing at an elite level. The first 10-20 games was actually averaging near 25 a game, great efficiency. Fortunately, that all changed when Andre Roberson got injured. I'm not suggesting that if he didn't, that Melo would have been an all-star and an elite player. He most likely would have progressed. However, it had a very large impact on the defense they ran and the way that OKC team did play. Nonetheless, to make the playoffs, Melo has a pretty poor year, and they get beaten in the first round. Now, in that first round, Carmelo actually had already changed his offense. He didn't take many shots, he didn't shoot too well, but as I said, he didn't really get into a rhythm either. He really let Westbrook run the show. Westbrook, who took up to 30 shots in certain games that series, got clamped by Ricky Rubio, his running mate PG, who got jingled as well by the Thunder Down Under, and then Melo, who took 7 shots in Game 7. And on defense, was getting bodied by Derek Favors, which I'm not going to pretend didn't happen. However, my point being, OKC's failure was not just due to Melo, it was a combination of things. Melo, at that stage, was not seen as part of a big three. Steven Adams was viewed as the bigger piece at that stage, which was a valid point, because it was factual. So they buy him out, moves to the Houston Rockets. Now, this Houston Rockets team had just taken the Golden State Warriors to 7. And if they didn't miss 27 threes in a row, which seems rather suspect to me. But anyway, they lost. They recouped by losing their 2 best wing defenders, Trevor Ariza, who got massively overpaid by the Suns and then just stopped caring, and Luke Mbah-a-Moute, who is a player already forgotten, despite him having an amazing season that year. I'd say he was actually greater than Trevor Ariza. Unfortunately, he got injured, and in the playoff series was a non-factor, and that was really the end of his career, to be blunt. So, that happens. They replaced 2 key wing defenders by getting Melo, which stylistically is a terrible fit. That team already had a lot of scoring. At Harden, Paul, Capella was a big threat as a rim runner and a lob threat. But on the inside, they didn't need Melo as much. And it showed as they ran him more in his spot-up capacity. Now, at this stage, Melo had already stated that he was willing to do whatever role, if it included being on the bench or starting, didn't impact him. Now, he did start, mainly due to injuries, because there were a lot of those. At the start of the season, Harden, Paul, and Melo played maybe 1 or 2 games together, and after 10, Carmelo Anthony was waived. Well, actually, he was shelved and then traded to the Bulls, who he never played for. But anyway, we'll just pretend he was waived. Now, the reason he was waived is because not only was he told to come off the bench, but they wanted to replace his minutes with Gary Clark. Gary Clark, noted NBA Hall of Famer and superstar. No, I have no problem with Gary Clark. Point being, it was a very weird decision for a team that was still trying to contend to have a G League level player essentially replace a Hall of Famer who still was an offensive threat, if not getting hunted on defense rather consistently in a switch-heavy scheme that really did not suit his strengths. Nonetheless, he's now begging media outlets to rejoin the NBA. I laugh because these same outlets are what made clips about, AP not coming off the bench so popular, and were feeding into the culture to hate on Carmelo Anthony. And then as soon as it was required, they then, had him as somewhat of a sob story, which is a rather vicious thing to do. Not that I'm surprised, it's just interesting to think about. Nonetheless, it happens, and he gets signed by the Trailblazers out of pure necessity. Zach Collins is out, they have no big men, they need someone. He joins, has a mini revitalization of sorts, definitely plays better than he did in Houston, comparable to how he played in OKC, I feel, but the expectations are much different. He's not a star anymore. He's a bench player / starter depending on what's required of him. Now, overall, I think he does great. He had a few games where he played like trash. He had a few games where he was great. For a minimum contract guy, you can't ask for any better than that. Now, my only nitpick was, even though they ran him in the post more and had a bit more ISO action for him, the games where he was heating up, it felt like they were kind of freezing him out a little, like CJ, Gary Trent, sometimes Simons. Didn't really seem to keep the hot hand going. However, I think that's something the NBA has an issue with as a whole. Kevin Love infamously had that happen with Kyrie a lot, where he just wouldn't get the ball after he started the game off amazingly, which, again, it doesn't make sense. But that's a whole other topic. So, he plays well for Portland, now he's signed to the Lakers, and the expectations are anything between he may start, he'll be a key player off the bench, duty's washed, and the Lakers will finish picking him up. Now, most likely, I think he'll be a spot starter who plays valuable minutes off the bench and plays in line with the last few seasons, averaging roughly around 10 points a game on okay-ish to slightly below average efficiency. However, taking very difficult shots and helping heat up to win a few games a year. That's all you can really ask of him. So getting back to the point, which is, why do I think that he's underrated? Aside from the fact that so many people call him overrated. The reason is because scoring is the most valuable part of basketball. We all love defense, we love playmaking, we love intangibles, we do. But scoring is the be-all and end-all. If you can score better than your opponent, you win.